Welcome to Kiffin's Keep, an intellectual resource for the pillar and buttress of the truth, which is the church. This is a project of the London Lyceum, which is all about serious thinking for a serious church. I'm Jordan Stefaniak, host of Kiffin's Keep and president of the London Lyceum, and as always, I'm excited to be here with you all today. And in today's episode, I will be covering the devilish doctrine of Univocity. Before we get started, remember, like the video if you enjoyed the content or if it stimulated your thought process, even if you disagree with it. Appreciate the likes. And then subscribe to the channel so you don't miss anything, whether that's from Kiffin's Keep, generally particular, or our general content as well, which we've got quite a few things coming through the pipeline, and hopefully they'll make their way to the finish line eventually. And then don't forget to comment if you agree, disagree, or have other thoughts or ideas. I love to hear from you all. Now, I want to cover the topic of Univocity, not because it's spicy, but partly because it's spicy, and it's only spicy to the nerds, but that's okay. I would imagine most people, if I walked into a church and asked them, hey, do you know what the doctrine of Univocity is? They would stare at me blankly and have no idea. So that's fine. But it's a very heated debate in theology, and I think a lot of it ends up being misplaced and misunderstood. And if you read a lot of the medieval scholars of today, they'll say there's not really a large disagreement between these two sort of camps or schools. So when it comes to, I guess, when we talk about Univocity, oftentimes it gets cashed out in terms of how Thomas Aquinas sort of defined these different categories. So if you've read Aquinas, it's in his Summa Theologiae 1:1-13, his treatise on the divine nature. I don't have the full set, but I like this one. This is very affordable. Hackett does a really nice job of making affordable copies of different texts like this. So if you turn to section 13, or I think it's question 13. Yeah, question 13. And then I think it's in article 5, where he's talking about different terms and how they relate to God. So if we were to say, God is wise, or God is blue, or God is, I mean, you pick any predicate there that you want to put in there. And he's going to ask, do these terms apply to God in a univocal way, an analogical way, or an equivocal way? So an equivocal way would simply mean by saying you may have the same name, but they're completely different meanings. So I don't know what's a good example of something where you have the same name. I mean, it could be, I guess, a proper name, corn. I don't know. Corn is a proper name, but there are different terms that can be used in completely different contexts for different things. They may be the same term, but they mean totally different things. And so if it was applied to God, if all our language of God was equivocal, it'd be like saying God is wise, but that doesn't mean actually anything. It means the opposite of wise, or means you have no idea what it means. And then you have univocal, which for Aquinas is going to mean like it corresponds exactly. So if I said God is wise and I am wise, we are wise in the exact same ways. So in the ways that I have to acquire my wisdom through experience and through knowledge acquisition, all these things that would apply to God in the same way. And then he has this middle category, which would be of analogy, the analogy of proportion, where there's not a single meaning in common, though there is some level of, I guess, correspondence. So he gives the analogy of health and how it's said of medicine and urine. So health is used differently there, but not totally differently. It's not equivocal, because when we talk about medicine being healthy and my urine being healthy, which, it's funny that he's using urine. That's a very odd example when you think about it. But anyway, medicine and urine are both healthy, but they're both healthy in different ways. Medicine is going to hopefully restore my health, whereas urine is sort of like it's an indicator of my health, I think. And so you've got these different senses in which health can be used across all sorts of different terms, and they're being used sort of analogically in different ways. Now, when it comes to God, that's going to be pretty obvious. God is wise. He's not wise just like me. He doesn't have to acquire wisdom. That he just is essentially has all of the wisdom that he has essentially, and at no point did he lack any of that wisdom. At no point did he need to acquire any of that wisdom. And so when you hear this sort of framework, it seems to be like, well, that's pretty obvious. Why would we ever say that God has, our terms for God are univocal in any sense? Well, that's where I think my friend John Duns Scotus is helpful. Not all of Scotus has been translated, but a good portion of it of it has, and there's been some new work out there, but this is an old one. Just these philosophical writings from Alan Wolter, and in here he's got some really nice little sections. And this is, I mean, you've got the Latin there side by side, but what he does in this is he talks about the necessity of univocal predication and why it is a true doctrine, and it must be true if we want to say anything true about God. And if you're interested, there is a somewhat new, well, I guess it's not new anymore now that I'm looking at it, 20 years old almost. Thomas Williams wrote an essay called The Doctrine of Univocity is True and Salutary. And it's arguing against sort of radical orthodoxy and Catherine Pickstock and some of those other sort of characters like John Milbank. I don't know if Milbank makes an appearance in this, but he's part of radical orthodoxy. And I remember the first time I read this, I was in a PhD seminar and I was vigorously trying to defend analogy and sort of a Thomistic stream of these things. And I read this essay and I thought it was terrible. And then I reread the essay later and I don't think I understood a lick of what I was reading. I just came with a presupposition that Univocity is bad and is incompatible with Thomistic framework or with classical doctrine or any of those things. I didn't know what I was talking about. Though Scotus is going to say Univocity is the way. And he's going to say being, just the concept of being is predicated commonly of created and uncreated being. But why? And he gives several reasons. Some of these are very sophisticated reasons that I don't quite understand. I've had to read them like 6 times and I still don't quite get what he's getting at. But some of these make sense, where he thinks being is sort of an irreducibly simple concept and there's no middle term that can exist between a being and an attribute. He thinks that God can't be known naturally unless being is univocal to created and uncreated. But fundamentally, when he defines univocity, he doesn't define this as an ontological concept, and this is difficult for some. They don't quite understand these distinctions here, because what I think is happening, and I think Tom Ward has argued this, and I think Joshua Lee Harris and others who are way smarter than me, and if they came on here and explained this, they'd explain it far better. So like, go listen to, I think we have a podcast episode at the London Lyceum with Joshua Lee Harris on analogy, and he's way better at explaining this concept than I am. But here I am doing it anyway, doing you a disfavor by trying to explain it in very elementary ways that don't make sense. But if that got you to go listen to that podcast episode, then I guess that's beneficial. But what I was saying is, I think people misunderstand what these two thinkers are trying to do. They're using very different frameworks and talking about very different things. What Scotus is trying to talk about is semantics and having valid syllogisms. So he says that univocity must have sufficient unity to serve as the middle term of a syllogism. That's what he's trying to get at. So he wants to be able to have a valid syllogism that where you can get from if something is perfect, then something is wise, therefore God is perfect, or whatever you may want to do. We want to have a term that is true, that can hold meaning. And I think what Aquinas and Scotus are doing is fundamentally the exact same thing. So Scotus isn't saying that you can just properly attribute whatever word like my wisdom to God and have all the same exact entailments. He's not doing that. He's very clear that that's not what he's doing. He talks about Anselm and sort of the process of predication and the process of how we remove we take a term when we remove all the imperfections, and then we ascribe it in the greatest possible perfection to God. That's what Aquinas is doing, and that's what fundamentally Scotus is trying to do. They're cashing it out with different terms and different frameworks. I think Scotus's framework is better and more consistent and clearer than Thomas's, but Thomas's isn't wrong. I think they're both right. They're fundamentally doing the same thing. So I think when you hear, lots of people think, lots of smart people think who read all these guys and their complete context, they're going to say that what Thomas is saying and Scotus are saying is the exact same thing. They're just saying it with different terminology. And so in a sense, I guess maybe they're using analogical predication. I don't know. Haha, funny joke. Maybe not joke. So when it comes to this, I think a contemporary resource that would be very valuable for those who are looking and thinking and wanting to understand this in a little bit plainer concepts than what Scotus, Scotus is notoriously extremely difficult to read. There's no doubt about that. He's very hard to read. So I would recommend, personally, I think Richard Swinburne's account in his Coherence of Theism, he's got 3 editions of this. The first one, then like a revised, and then a second edition. And those legit mean revised editions, like he's actually gone through and made significant updates. So the latest one, the second, or I guess is it the revised? I think it's the second edition is the last one. He has an account of, he goes through the accounts of analogy and different things like that, but he tries to give it a contemporary explanation of what language is doing. And he cashes this out in terms of, so I think he uses the terminology of a main entailment or a core entailment with all these mini entailments. So what's true when we are talking about God versus other things is this core main entailment. That is univocal. It corresponds between the two things. Whereas all these mini entailments do not necessarily transfer over when we're talking about different things. And so this preserves valid syllogisms. This preserves, I think, valid language, because if you have pure analogy all the way down, that's equivocation. Analogy requires a univocal core of some sort. And if you don't understand that, then you need to go back and read the source material more and come to a better understanding of what's going on. That's just fundamentally necessary. You can't have analogy all the way down, because that's just what equivocation is. Analogy requires some sort of core univocal entailment. Now, people think univocity, the terminology of univocal, is the boogeyman, and so you can't use that term. I think that's just silly and foolish. We're grown-ups. We're not 5-year-olds. We can use terms and understand that they're used differently in different contexts. Radical orthodoxy just doesn't understand what univocity is, and they're attributing all these false sort of claims to it, and we can reclaim the terminology and still say it's useful and good, let's use it. And if you're afraid to use the term, then use something else but mean the exact same thing. That's fine, whatever. So Swinburne account, this main sort of core entailment. So let's take wisdom or love. Let's take love, for example. If I say God is love and I am loving, God is loving and I am loving. Well, there is a core entailment to say that love means something. It's this willing of the good to someone else, or this willing of the good. Now, in my case, it's not a eternal willing of the good, because I fluctuate all the time. I don't have maximal love like I should. I sometimes lack love in total, whereas God never lacks love. He's always willing the good. And so he's got all these different like mini entailments that are different than mine when we're describing love. But we're still describing this idea of willing the good that corresponds between the two. Mine may be significantly different, but there is something that's holding this meaning between these two things together. So I think Swinburne's account is really helpful in sort of explaining what exactly is going on, apart from sort of the medieval context where some of these arguments can become very difficult. But I would recommend to you, I mean, if you're interested in this debate, go get these two resources, read them side by side. You're going to have to read Scotus like 10 times to fully understand it. Scotus talks about this elsewhere. So does Aquinas. Aquinas has it in his Seba contra Gentiles. I think that is a really nice place to start for a lot of people who are first starting with Thomas, because it's just, I think it's, yeah, I guess it's 5 volumes, I think. I have the Notre Dame Press version, which is very affordable, and you can go get that, and it's a nice translation, and you can get a wide understanding of what Thomas is up to in a very small way without having to read everything. So that, I think that's what I recommend usually starting. And then Scotus, well, just good luck. You're swimming in the deep end. I apologize. One of the great things about Aquinas is he's very clear and easy to understand for the most part, even where there's times where he disagrees with himself later on. Who doesn't when you write such a when you write such maximal amounts of material, magnificent, whatever it is. So that's that on univocity. I think univocity is a fine term to use. I think Thomas Williams is right. It's true and salutary, but you got to understand what it's up to correctly. It's not this pure univocity that Aquinas is describing. That's not what univocity is fundamentally supposed to mean. If it means what Aquinas is saying, then yeah, we don't want univocity, we want analogy. But if you're using other sort of frameworks and terms, univocity is just fine. And I think what univocity actually means is sort of this main core entailment, like Swinburne cashes out, is what's true across, it corresponds between the two things. These mini entailments are different, and that does fundamentally shift the fullness and the meaning of the term. But there's still a core portion of the term that corresponds. And if you don't want to have that, then you can't say that God is loving and have any knowledge of what it is. You can't say that God is wise and have any knowledge of what that is. There's nothing there to ground any sort of formal knowledge. You're going to collapse into equivocation. And I think if you read even, I mean, how many schools of Thomism are there? If you read Gregory P. Roca, I think that's how you pronounce his name. He's got what's the volume? I'm trying to think of it. Something about the incomprehensible God or something like that. Really, really nice volume. And he cashes it out in these like different Thomistic sort of categories and languages, using Latin terms, the res significata and modus operandi and all these different things. If you're not as smart as those guys like me, you can read Richard Swinburne and I think have a modern English account of what's going on that I think explains it very nicely, because no one that I know of is saying when you say univocal that they correspond totally exactly in every exact thing. But analogy is not like some sophisticated way to say this is the only mode of divine communication, because Aquinas' examples of health, that's analogy. And so it's not like it's preserving the creator distinction by itself to say, well, we have recourse to analogy. Analogy is something we use in everyday language when we talk about anything. So if you're interested in this debate more, I'll try to remember to link to the show notes. Joshua Lee Harris has a ton of really, really helpful stuff, and he's just a fantastic teacher in general. So I just recommend all of his stuff. Way, way, way better than I am at communicating these things. Thomas Williams has that nice paper that I'll try to remember to link to. It is definitely located in a period and discussing particular literature. And so it has some of those natural shortcomings of not being this completely evergreen resource. Maybe it is. I'll need to reread the full thing again. Maybe I changed my mind once again. And then Richard Swinburne's book, I'll try to remember to link to that. And then these two really affordable volumes, if you don't have them, I recommend getting them. If you are super nerdy into these things, you'll get the like really nice Blackfriars editions and all that. But anyway, I appreciate you guys tuning in. Hopefully this is useful. Let me know what you think. Do you disagree? Do you agree? Are you afraid of the terminology of Univocity for some reason that you think that I should be more leery of using the term? It has too many bad correlations and it can't be overcome or something like that. I'd love to hear it and see why you think that's the case. I don't think it is, obviously. I think Univocity is good and we can use that term. Anyway, I appreciate you all tuning in to Kiffin's Keep, and I look forward to thinking with you all.